What's good, y'all? BeatGenerals.com back with a brand new tutorial. In this tutorial, we're actually going to be taking a look at making a Weeknd style track. This track is kind of based on more of his newer stuff, not really the trilogy series, but it's a little more kind of pop influence, sounds a little bit more radio friendly, but it still features those nice kind of melodies and that eerie kind of vibe that he wants. All the sounds that we'll be using in this are provided by www.studiosounds.com, so all the VST presets and the actual drum sounds can be found over there. Definitely a worthwhile investment. So in this first little chapter, we're actually going to be just taking a look at the drums, and then in the following chapters we'll actually be doing the instruments and the sequencing and show you how everything came together. So without further talking, let's jump into the next section and get started on it. So many of you that watch my tutorials know that I usually never start with the drums first. I like to actually do my instruments first, and the reason for that being is usually if I do the drums first, when I add my instruments later, they'll end up kind of being too in the pocket. I'm too focused on the drums, so all my stuff will just not be as loose and kind of creative as it can be. But for this one, I actually started with the drums and it worked out well, so I guess it just kind of depends on your mood or what you're going for. But basically, I started this track out with three elements: 2 kicks and a snare, and these are all from the Perfect Weeknd kit from studiosounds.com. I have my BPM set to 110. This is going to be a double time track, so the actual BPM would be 55 technically. But we're going to go ahead and actually just go ahead and lay the snare in. This is a nice full thick snare. This track is kind of more geared towards his like pop radio stuff, which has a little bit more of, not even, I wouldn't even call it conventional R&B drums, because it just sounds a lot different than conventional R&B, but it has some nice little kind of fuller pop elements with kind of almost a live type feel incorporated in there. So that was kind of my thinking behind these drums. So I'm going to go ahead and lay this little pattern in. And I'll have something like this, and make sure that all these are set to cut itself, especially if you're going to be doing rolls like this. You want to make sure that your kicks and stuff are on cut itself, they're not overlapping. If they overlap, you lose a little bit of the punch in the kick. So even if you're using a short type sound, it's always a good idea just to make sure if things are playing back to back, such as right here or different places, you want to have that cut itself on just so you don't lose the punch of your drums. And basically this is what I had to start off with. So I have a nice little drum groove to start off with. It's still nice and open. The percussion that we're going to be adding is really going to add the groove to this track. So when you're starting off with your main drums, you kind of want to keep them nice and open and airy. That'll kind of help you with that whole ambient sound. And then the cool thing about it is when you have your percussion adding the groove to it, you can drop that percussion in and out. So you can have parts that sound a lot slower if you're just playing these little drums, or you can have parts like for the hook or different pieces where you can drop in the percussion with it and make it sound a lot more up-tempo and full. So that was the thinking behind this. Once I had this, I make sure I send it to the piano roll. I hit Alt and Q on my keyboard, and I pop up with the quantizer. Now this is a big step. A lot of people, they really just don't do this. They'll just click in their drums or whatever. But there's a ton of different quantized settings in FL Studio, and they'll make the slightest of changes basically to your drums or whatever your pattern is, but in the end it'll actually sound a lot better. It'll have more of a humanized type feel, so you'll get that more of a bounce and a head nod versus having everything directly on the grid. So it'll just slightly shift stuff off the grid. Like I said, I like the 16 MPC2 setting, but there's a ton of different stuff in here. If you want to do more West Coast stuff, more hip hop, East Coast type stuff, and different grooves you can choose from. So we're going to go ahead and just use the 16 MPC2. I usually keep my snares, I don't quantize those to any of this. And then you can just CTRL-V, copy and paste this pattern down, so you don't have to do it again, since we're just layering 2 kicks to get a fuller sound. But basically, like I said, I'll do the kicks and then I'll do my percussion later and stuff like that, but I usually don't do the snares. But this is what I started off with basically. So a nice open groove, have the little roll over here, just make it sound a little bit quicker. If you're doing a track with a slower BPM, you can use rolls and different stuff like that also to kind of make the pace seem a little bit quicker and give yourself the illusion basically of a little bit of a faster track, even though the BPM doesn't really change. This is something that you hear vinyls use a ton. He'll have really slow BPMs with a bunch of different little drops and rolls and stuff, and it really makes the track sound like it's a lot faster than it is. But anyway, so this is what I started off with. Let's jump in the next section, continue. So now that we have our drum track over here, we're going to go over to pattern 2 and we're going to start adding more of our percussion elements. Our drum track is nice and open, so now we can use the percussion elements and the hats and stuff to really kind of add a nice groove to this. And like I said, we can always take these hats in and out to really kind of give the track a different feel. You can have, you know, almost a completely different sounding track at parts where there is no percussion elements. You can have a more ambient, laid back type feel, or you can add them and have a nice kind of fuller type feeling, maybe for like a hook or like a bridge section or whatever you want to do, or even for a verse. So you can basically make the verse sound more full and upbeat, and you can take the hook and maybe make it sound more kind of down tempo and a little bit open and more airy. So that's the cool thing about doing percussion like this. It kind of gives you a couple of different choices when you're sequencing, which I really like. So I have a couple of different elements in here. The first one we're going to start with is the hi-hat July, and all we're going to do is fill each 4 steps. So we'll basically have something like this. Then we're going to use this hi-hat eyes, and we're basically going to just fill in a couple of little notes in between here, just to add a little bit of variation between the hats and have a kind of a couple different little grooves going on. Okay, and then before we go any further, piano roll, Alt and Q. And then make sure you use whatever, you could actually, even depending on your skill or kind of your ear, you can definitely switch up different templates and use like one quantized settings for the hats or a different quantized setting for the drums, or excuse me, the kicks. But I usually, if I use one, that's usually what I'm going to stick with throughout the whole track. So I'm going to use the 16 MPC2 for all my quantization on this track. Do the same thing over here. Okay, now I have these 2 different little perk type sounds, and they almost have a little bit of a groove to them. Luckily for me, they actually fit my BPM, but you could always time stretch them if they didn't, if you wanted to like put one beat and keep it generic so it doesn't actually change the pitch of the sound. You could go that way depending on what you're using. But like I said, luckily for me, they actually fit my BPM. So what I did was I basically added this in this kind of manner, and then added this right here at the end, kind of just slightly switch it up, and this is kind of the sound I had. Okay, so that, in my opinion, gave it a little bit more of a Weeknd type feel. It kind of had that eeriness to it, almost like, sometimes I kind of compare it to more kind of the horror movie soundtracks. You'll hear a lot of the sounds, if you guys pay attention to movie soundtracks and stuff like that. A lot of the stuff they use in those tracks is very reminiscent of soundtracks like that. There's a lot of stuff that kind of really builds anticipation, builds emotion, and really build suspense. So that's always a good thing if you want to go back and study some pieces of music. Definitely go back, look at some of the scores for your favorite horror movie films, and it's a great way to kind of get ideas and incorporate them back into, you know, today's modern music, if you're just kind of tired of listening to the same stuff over and over. But yeah, so this is what I had initially. Alt and Q as well on this. And then I'm going to add this little tambourine, and if you guys look, this will basically line up with the snares, just kind of thicken up the snares and make it a little bit more interesting. And the same thing again, since this is percussion type elements, we're going to go ahead and quantize it. And I went ahead and laid this out right here, just so you guys can kind of hear the difference. And let's just kind of take a listen to kind of how more open and airy this sounds compared to when these drop in. It just sounds a lot more busy and like there's a lot more going on. And if you really technically look at it, it's really not a huge difference or a huge difference in effort to kind of add something like this. But when you're doing R&B type stuff or more pop type stuff, even the simplest little things can really make a big difference. A great example of that actually is the Katy Perry featuring Juicy J, like Dark Horse track from a while ago. If you listen to that track, there's so many little small subtle changes. It's literally adding like one little drum sound or different things like that, and it really makes all the difference in those tracks. So just something to keep in mind when you're doing more R&B and pop stuff. But let's go ahead and take a listen to it. Okay, so if you look at it, in my opinion, I hope you guys can hear that. This section right here just sounds a lot slower and like it's just dragging a lot more compared to when this section comes in. You just kind of get automatically a little bit more of an energetic up tempo type feel, and it's still, as you guys can see, the same BPM. It didn't really change. One thing we will do though is take these little percussion sounds, and one thing that you kind of see in the Weeknd's music a lot, there's a lot of filtering and different effects and EQs to kind of really give stuff their space. Now I'm gonna have a nice heavy thick bass line in this, so I don't really want a lot of low type stuff interfering, and you guys will be able to see that in the final mix as well. But basically stuff like this is just a perk sound. It's not supposed to be super heavy in your face. I'm going to go ahead and load up a parametric EQ2 on a mixer channel. I have them both set to the same mixer channel, and then basically all I'll do is just go ahead and roll off a lot of the lows. Okay, so that sounds good in my opinion. It sounds a little bit better. It's going to give me a little bit more space in my mix later on. And then another thing that you might want to do, if for example, like these drums, they have more of a live type feel, or these hats do. If you really wanted to kind of go down that road of making them sound a lot more like just a regular kind of drum kit, you definitely want to play with the velocities a little bit, and just adding some subtle little velocity changes will just make it, you know, even more humanized and sound a lot more like a real drummer versus just keeping them all at the same velocity. And this obviously works better if there's like more kind of notes. So if you had maybe something like this, you can kind of really build grooves with these. Okay, something like that. But I'm going to keep mine pretty simple and just kind of keep it how it was for now. But yeah, so let's jump in the next section, continue. So the next thing I added to this was a tom and a crash. Basically, toms are pretty cool. Toms you can use for different things. Obviously, you can use them for transitions and just kind of add a little spice to your drums and to your patterns. But a cool thing with toms also is that I personally sometimes like to layer them directly with the kick, just kind of give myself a bigger sound if I'm doing R&B stuff. So if you haven't tried that before, definitely kind of check it out and try layering some toms over your kicks for a bigger sound. And if you're going for a more even cinematic type sound, you can change the tom out and use something like a timpani or something to get an even bigger kind of more cinematic type sound. So definitely check that out if you've never done that before. But basically for this track, all I'm going to be doing is doing a little kind of little transition piece right here towards the end of the pattern. So what we'll do is we'll add a quick little pattern in here like this, and then we're going to go ahead and send this to the piano roll. With toms, if you ever pay attention to drum kit, there's obviously lower and kind of more bass type toms and more kind of higher type tom sounds. So you do kind of want to play with different notes, just kind of find something that fits. And in my opinion, what I ended up using was I basically used a G, then I brought it down to a B, and then we went down to an A, and then ended on a C. And you want to make sure we quantize these as well, Alt and Q. And then you can also play with the note panning a little bit, just to make it a little bit more interesting. And this is kind of what we get by itself. Okay, so it doesn't sound bad. And then we're gonna go ahead and add this to a free mixer track, and we're gonna actually add a couple different elements to this. I want this kind of have a bigger type sound, so we're gonna go ahead and put a fruity reverb 2. We're gonna turn the size all the way up. Then we're gonna turn the decay maybe like around 5 seconds, just to have a bigger type sound. Then we're going to go ahead and adjust the low cut. We want this to be kind of a high end reverb, so we don't want this to kind of cover the whole sound. So I'm going to go ahead and just turn this up slightly, just so we'll cover more of the high frequencies. And we have something like this after we do that. Then the next effect we're going to add to this is a delay. I use the Fruity Delay 2. We're going to set the timing to 1 step. We're going to do the panning, set it to ping pong, and then just use the panning to the left or the right, just so it'll bounce from speaker to speaker. Then we're going to go ahead and just slightly turn the volume down, just so it's not as prominent. It's going to play the background a little bit more. And then we're going to just come in here, put a Fruity Parametric EQ, and just slightly cut the low end, just so, like I said, it doesn't really interfere later with everything that we're going to be adding to this track. And this will be a cool little transition effect that we can use. And before we actually play it, let's go to pattern 5. I have this little cymbal, which is more like an 808 crash, but it has a little bit of the top end filtered out. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to add a delay to it, ping pong again, probably use maybe 2 steps. We'll see. We'll kind of play with it, and then set the panning to left or right again for it to bounce, and turn this down. So we have something like this. So we have that kind of heavy tail end to the crash. It doesn't just come in and out. And then let's go ahead and kind of play what this sounds like together. Okay, so that sounds pretty good. Let's jump in the next section and add our 808 to this.